Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of I podcast. And today I'm joined by Thijs Voskuilen. And today we're going to be discussing a book that he co-authored with Rosemary Sheldon titled Operation Messiah, St. Paul, Roman Intelligence, and the Birth of Christianity. The link to purchase this book will be in the affiliate link in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Thijs Voskuilen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So this theory that you and Rosemary Sheldon go with is very different from how many imagine Paul. There's a lot of different theories about Paul, but what y'all do is y'all suggest that Paul was a well-connected man. He was an agent of the Romans, and I would like you to take us through this presentation and explain to the audience what the evidence is for this and what the implications of this is.
All right. So I assume you have my presentation on screen right now?
Yes, I do. I see it.
Okay. All right. Welcome to my presentation. This is a counterintelligence analysis of the man many consider the founder of Christianity, the Apostle Paul, or as I will keep calling him, Saul of Tarsus. And I think after this presentation, it's clear why I keep calling him that. So yeah, Jacob, first of all, I'm honored that you invited me here to talk about this subject in your podcast. I hope that times have changed and that we can have a constructive discussion or a dialogue about it. Maybe this can be a start or at least an opening for a team analysis project, which I'll get into later. In advance, I thank you for the opportunity. In this presentation, I'll walk you through the following subjects. First, my personal background and how this theory came about. Second, in response to a question you sent beforehand, how was the thesis received? And then a new approach, combined with the work we already did in Operation Messiah, which is a security screening of Saul of Tarsus, both at the moment he entered the movement and again 20 years later. I explain why I chose that method shortly. Fourth, I'll cover a few red flags that James Olson, and he's the former head of counterintelligence for the CIA, says to watch for when someone walks in from the enemy camp, claiming they want to work for you or with you. He outlines these in the book To Catch a Spy. Fifth, I'll show some patterns in Saul's life that are especially relevant from a counterintelligence perspective, set against the larger backdrop of the conflict between Romans and Jews. And finally, I'll introduce a method that was suggested to me for this case, which is called the Analysis of Competing Hypotheses, or ACH. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a structured method for intelligence analysis developed at the CIA. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation, where sources are limited, fragmentary, and possibly unreliable. I'm going to invite people to join this investigation and give their input on a website I've launched especially for that purpose. More on that later. The final section will cover the results of these methods and what they mean. Before we dive into this material, I'll briefly introduce myself and share a bit of my background. First, some of the questions you sent me beforehand. What's your personal relationship to Christianity and what's your theory exactly? Well, I was a Christian when I first thought of the idea that the Apostle Paul was not who he claimed to be, that he was really still persecutor Saul of Tarsus, only using another name and other tactics to fight the original Jesus movement. In fact, I'd once gone through something of a conversion myself, and I have much to thank Christianity for, so this idea did not come from frustration, and it certainly was not an attack. For me, it started as fiction, a typo really. I was writing about a friend, a childhood friend named Paul, but I accidentally typed Saul. So later I thought, what if Saul of Tarsus never really changed? What if he never became Paul? I realized that the name Saul or Paul could refer to the same person. This was a fiction idea, but it stayed in my head, and I wanted it to be possible for Saul of Tarsus before I explored the story further, even as a fiction story. So I ran the idea by a Paul scholar, and he said, to me, this is new, and it is possible that Saul of Tarsus never really became Paul, but that he was lying about it, basically. So I thought, maybe this is not just fiction, I could do more with this. I ended up writing my master thesis on it for my history studies, and the thesis was called The Perfect Spy, and it was later published in Holland and Belgium as Alias Paulus. You can see the gray book. It was supervised by Professors Frank Ankersmit and Jan Bremmer at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And I approached it more or less like a criminal case. You build a theory, you investigate, you can become convinced of somebody's guilt, but you're always looking for reasons you may be wrong. But in this case, that never happened. The deeper I looked into the possibility that I started out with, the idea that he was still Saul, acting like Paul, the more likely it seemed that Saul was a Roman agent indeed. The thesis also included a screenplay for a movie, which was actually the first thing I ever wrote about the idea. You can get the thesis on the website that I'm going to put up too. That thesis became an article, Operation Messiah, published in Small Wars and Insurgencies. And later I wrote a book by the same name, the book that you already referred to, with Colonel Rosemary Sheldon of the Virginia Military Institute. I had contacted her because she was an expert on espionage and covert warfare in the ancient world. And she agreed the Roman agent hypothesis was the best fit. Since then, I've completed a Master in Criminal Investigation or Detective School for the Dutch police. I've studied some deception detection, and I've worked more recently on a new analysis of Saul of Tarsus using modern counterintelligence tools. And here's where it gets interesting. One of your questions was, how do you recognize a secret spy? And that question made me look for current open source intelligence guides, like materials I hadn't used in earlier publications. Back then, I could only find memoirs, but nothing like, How to Catch a Spy, that kind of book. But some time ago, I found the book To Catch a Spy by James Olson, and he's the former chief of CIA counterintelligence, which was published in 2019. And there it was, a cold stare checklist, a list of things that are typical for a false defector or double agent, the kind of list or method I'd really been looking for all along. Olson's red flags are not about one type of possible defector in particular. They fit all kinds, left-wing, right-wing, religious, secular. They're all judged by the same standards. And when you apply the checklist to Saul, it gets very interesting. I'll walk you through it later. And a few years ago, Guillaume de Valk, he's a university teacher in intelligence analysis techniques, recommended I use the ACH method for the subject matter. That was, as I said, developed by the CIA for intelligence situations with partial, unreliable, or conflicting sources, which are the type of sources we have on Paul. I'll explain that method later too and the results, and they too are pretty interesting, I think. First, I want to make something clear because I know how this comes across. You have a totally different viewpoint on everything that's been said about Paul before. But suspicion of Saul, which I call him, it's not fringe. And this is not a conspiracy theory in the usual sense. It's actually very simple. It assumes Saul never changed. Once an agent, always an agent. That's not really complicated at all. And it's also not just a new idea. In fact, it might be the oldest explanation of all, because that's exactly what the original followers of Jesus believed, including his own brother James. They did not recognize the Jesus that Saul described, a Jesus Paul had never met. All he had was a vision, he said. And it looks like they could have been right distrusting Saul of Tarsus from the start, his original followers. Now, I realize that may sound like an unusual combination, Christianity and counterintelligence. But in fact, it may be the most down-to-earth lens we've ever applied to the story. Because what happens when we look at Saul of Tarsus, not as a saint or a theologian, but as a subject in a security investigation? What if we assess him the way intelligence services evaluate defectors, infiltrators, or possible double agents? That's the approach I've taken now, the one Colonel Sheldon and I laid the groundwork for in our book Operation Messiah. Because Saul was, at the start, a law enforcement officer, a man working for the authorities. And then supposedly he joined the enemy. Christians call that a conversion. But from where he was coming from, that's a defection. And in intelligence terms, that means one thing: he should be vetted. And when we do that, when we apply the tools of modern security screening or counterintelligence that are used in that type of scenario, the results are surprisingly coherent, and they show that a controlled operation is very much possible. So here's the simple claim. Once an agent, always an agent, like I said. That's how defectors should be approached. In fact, in real life, that's how they are approached, always. They're always vetted. So we have to assume, what we always do is assume continuity in personality, loyalty, and agenda, unless we can be convinced to think otherwise. As Olson said in his book, To Catch a Spy, don't trust anyone, Controlled paranoia in counterintelligence officers is a virtue, not a vice. So Saul of Tarsus, better known as the Apostle Paul, claimed to switch sides from the government to a dissident group. But it's possible that this switch never actually happened. It's possible he stayed loyal to his original mission to fight the Jewish Jesus movement, just in disguise. When you really look at the data, it's actually the simplest explanation. The man never changed. It fits everything we know. A lot of oddities suddenly make sense, and I'll discuss those later. And again, this is not a new idea. The earliest followers of Jesus did not trust him either. They saw what he was doing and they tried to stop it. This analysis shows they might have been right. So how was the thesis received? This was one of your questions you sent me beforehand. What have historians and contemporaries said on this issue? Well, some were on board. A few even said it was the most likely explanation for a number of things we'll discuss. Paul scholars, though, mostly silence. I did debate a few of them at the invitation of journalists when my book came out. And one professor who had written a major biography on Paul told a journalist off the record that the possibility presented in my book kept him up at night. He couldn't sleep. I wasn't supposed to know that, but I found out. Later, he denied the thesis in public. But if it were nonsense, why lie awake? Apparently, he wasn't too confident. The theory shook him, but he didn't let on to the outside world. A handful of academics have called it the most likely explanation, and Peter Ernest, who is a former CIA officer and director of the International Spy Museum, called it good intelligence work. Colonel Sheldon gave a lecture on our book at the museum. Still, no symposium invitation, not once. Silence from Paul scholarship. Professor Ankersmit, who supervised the thesis, a historian, kind of predicted this in the beginning. He said the theory doesn't build on others, it replaces them. And when that happens, the first reactions are almost always the same: ridicule, silence, hostility. Nobody can say exactly why it's wrong, he said, and that's the pattern you often see when something turns out to be right. Of course, that doesn't prove that this is all true, but it would fit a somewhat typical pattern. So to understand the story of Saul, we need to begin with the historical backdrop. It's a history of politics and warfare. First of all, the Romans were occupying Judea. Tensions were high and resistance was building. Within decades, it would erupt into a full-scale revolt. We could call it a war. Here's something not a lot of people know, but Jews are estimated to have made up about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. To put it in perspective, 10% of Americans today is over 30 million people. So imagine a large group of people brought together by a shared identity, a longing for freedom, and a hope that God would soon bring justice at Rome's expense. The Jewish resistance was on the rise. And you might ask, were the Romans capable of pulling off an operation like this? And the short answer is yes. Rome didn't just rule by force. As Colonel Sheldon has shown, they used covert methods, including covert agents, to undermine opposition. She taught this stuff at the Virginia Military Institute. They infiltrated and sabotaged opposition movements from within, using insiders as agents was standard practice. Think of Judas. Betrayal from within was a known tactic. Jesus was not executed for blasphemy. He was eliminated as a political threat. That's how he was perceived. And Saul started as a persecutor of the remaining Jesus movement, which was still considered a threat after all. He was persecuting them with official backing, before suddenly switching sides. And the only sources we have for that shift is the book of Acts, written decades after Saul's life, and 7 surviving letters attributed to him. That's the puzzle we're working with. It's not a grand situation. It's not rocket science. It's one book of Acts, 7 letters, and as I like to say, a bunch of guys on horses. It's not an extremely complicated situation from a counterintelligence standpoint. This timeline puts Saul's activities side by side with major Roman actions toward the Jewish people. If you want to skip this part or edit it out, I totally understand. But to be complete, I thought I'd make this slide so that people can see the general history if they want to. What's especially interesting, I think, is the expulsion of Jews from Rome around 49 CE. It supposedly happened because of unrest at the instigation of Chrestos, likely some kind of reference to early messianic disputes. Whatever it was about, Jewish unrest must have been pretty serious for so many Jews to be chased out of Rome. So when Saul was active, there was a very tense political situation between Romans and Jews. Now, here's the real problem. The exact same data supports two entirely different stories. We go from top to bottom. Saul preached obedience to authority. Maybe that's just Paul telling people to be good citizens, but maybe it's a continuation of his role as an agent. His pro-Roman messaging could be theology or strategy. 17 missing years, strange no matter what. It's either personal retreat for whatever reason, or maybe he was doing things that had nothing to do with being an apostle. His VIP treatment by Roman authorities, such as every time Romans protected him from Jewish anger, that's certainly easy to explain if he never truly switched sides. Why would the Romans be so good to a dissident, a man who was supposedly speaking for a guy they had crucified for being a political threat? The long-running conflict with some Jewish members of the movement and their lasting distrust, that too fits both frames. So the question is, what's more likely and how do we choose? Well, here's the thing I realized when preparing for this interview. Deciding whether a defector is trustworthy is not the job of historians and theologians per se. It's not what they were trained for. So we should not be asking their opinion only on the subject. I understand the knee-jerk response, and for a long time, I didn't have a better alternative, but now I think I do. Because deciding whether or not a defector is trustworthy that belongs to a specific profession sounds silly, but I only realized that during the preparation for this podcast. In counterintelligence, national security, and corporate security, that's a core skill. You assess someone's background, the risk profile, their real loyalty. I went through that kind of vetting myself before being admitted to the Master of Criminal Investigation program. You're subjected to the rules of a security screening. And in that world, the question is not, how sincere does he seem? It is, do you trust him or not? And the burden is not on the investigator, it's on the defector. If there is reasonable doubt, you shut the door to the defector or the candidate for a job that requires such a vetting. That's a turning point here. This is a potential false defector case, which means we're in potential double agent territory. Now, a double agent is someone who pretends to switch sides but stays loyal to their original employer. That's a standard tactic and a possibility that is taken into account with every defector. Every time someone says he wants to work for the other side, this is the first question that you ask. Can he be trusted? It's been that way for every defector in history. So the question should be asked about Saul of Tarsus too. As James Olson puts it, there's nothing more delectable than a good, juicy double agent operation. It doesn't get much better than to dupe your adversary with a control case. And once I saw that possibility for Saul, I couldn't unsee it. To put it bluntly, I think this was a juicy Roman double agent operation, and Saul's work under the name Paul amounted to a controlled operation. Now, how does that vetting process work? Maybe some of you know that already, but for those who don't, I'll briefly explain it. First step is a security screening. In the US, they use an SF-86 form. That's a 130-page questionnaire that you have to fill out. You can find it online. It covers everything: education, professional background, personal references, financial status, foreign contacts, travel, military history, affiliations, every connection you might have. Then comes the background investigation and the assessment, including of how you come across. What are they looking for? Red flags, gaps in the story, patterns that don't add up, signs you're withholding information, that you're not fully transparent. I use the same method on defector Saul twice. Once at the moment of his so-called defection, I call that the Genesis check, following a term that James Olson uses. And once 20 years later, after his full career, it's called a reinvestigation. That is standard in real vetting. You repeat it over time to check whether someone's still walking a straight line. Now, the second step I took is I did an ACH, or the analysis of competing hypotheses. As I said, that's a structured method developed with an intelligence agency, the CIA, and it's not about proving your favorite theory. It's about laying out multiple explanations side by side and then seeing which one holds up. You take all the available evidence and then ask which explanation fits the facts best, or which ones fail at doing that. You don't build a case, you pressure test every theory, and you let the weak ones fail. I applied ACH to this case at the suggestion of Dr. Gilliam de Valk, who teaches this method professionally. So another one of your questions was, how does one recognize a spy? Of course, spy is a very general term that covers all types of agents. In this case, the question would be, How does one recognize a false defector or a double agent? Now, if we start with the first step, the filling out of that SF-86 form to make a structured list of everything we know about Sauls Letters that's relevant to an investigation like this, here's the first problem. We know almost nothing about him. No dates, no relatives, nothing certain about where he went to school, no friends, acquaintances, former colleagues, no track record at work, not one address, not even a physical description. So you cannot fill out 1% of the form. By today's standards, that alone would disqualify him. He would be sent home immediately, no way to verify his background. So, as James Olsen, that former CIA counterintelligence chief, puts it, when in doubt, keep them out. That's the motto in that kind of work. He also says, and I quote, if you're a supervisor, a security officer, or a counterintelligence officer, and your gut tells you that one of your employees is no longer deserving of your full trust, act decisively. Any doubts as to an employee's suitability should be resolved in favor of the government. Meaning, if they give you a bad feeling and it's serious enough, they're out, or they're moved to a position where they can do no harm. So ask yourself, would you advise the original Jesus movement to trust Sauls Letters based on all this? If so, based on what? The answer seems simple. He fills the first basic check. But of course, the story doesn't stop here. Here's the story of Sauls Letters on the road to Damascus. He starts as a persecutor. He's carrying the instructions for the mission, Act says. He's ready to arrest people, accompanied by a number of men we know nothing about. But we do know who he's targeting. They were Jews, religious Jews. Acts 9:2 tells us he aimed to arrest any who belonged to the way, still inside the synagogues. Messianist movements posed a threat not just to the high priest in Jerusalem, who was in effect a puppet of the Romans. If they believed in the coming of a Messiah, a Jewish king, they were a threat to Rome itself. So when Saul went after these people, he wasn't pursuing people who believed in God in a different way. He was neutralizing resistance to the Roman-backed order. And the Romans would need Jews to persecute movements like that at this point. People who could talk to informers, read the streets, people who understood the enemy and what they were saying. And there were Jews cooperating with the Romans, such as the high priest and his personnel. And Saul may have been one of them, or if he was indeed a Roman citizen, he could have been a man the Romans had inside the high priest ranks. But then he suddenly flips. He says he had a vision of Jesus, but there were no credible witnesses, no independent verification. Even Acts gives conflicting accounts. He says he cannot see anymore. He's blinded. Then, to make a long story short, he's delivered to the movement in Damascus. There's someone in the enemy camp who can cure him, and he does. Saul then starts preaching in the synagogues. People don't trust him, and they want to kill him. He escapes with the help from anonymous men, people who are out to kill him, but he escapes. It appears that the people he came to arrest quickly turned on him. So this was a movement willing to kill someone they believed had infiltrated them. That can tell you something about what kind of group that was. A group that was violent against suspected government personnel, and that would have to be persecuted just because of that. And then something strange happens, because Saul's desertion, that's what it was, had no consequences. There was no arrest, no trial, no punishment, no follow-up from his former employers. They just said, you want to join the enemy? Sure, that's all right, good luck. No way that would be the response to a real defection. From a counterintelligence perspective, that's a flashing red dashboard. You have a sudden shift in allegiance, a suspicious incident, unexpected help underground, and total silence from his old team. That's not a conversion, that's another kind of pattern. From a CI standpoint or counterintelligence standpoint, red flags everywhere. If you're a Jewish resistance organization, why would you trust a guy with a story like that? And this almost made me fall off my chair when I read it. I was reading this neat list of things James Olsen says we should look out for when when trying to determine if someone, a defector, is for real. I quote, the best indicator that an agent is bona fide is without any doubt production. Production is so important in smoking out double agents that a case officer should not be bashful in demanding from every new or prospective agent upfront proof of bona fides in the form of a significant piece of intelligence. So the first and most important thing to look for is this. Is the defector giving you any good secrets? In Saul's case, the answer is clear: no. The big red flag in the whole story is this: he never shared any persecutor inside knowledge with the Jesus movement, not once. No information about persecution tactics, no names of informers or other people who are after them, no locations or where the persecutors were staying or planning to strike in Damascus, no warnings, nothing. And this was not a matter of access. He had access because he was carrying the instruction for the mission, Acts says. But when it came time to prove that he was legit, he delivered nothing. That's not how real defectors behave. Something is really wrong, it seems. Now let's look at the rest of James Olson's red flag checklist, the same tool used, I guess, by CIA counterintelligence when someone walks in claiming to defect. What would they notice about Saul if he was approaching them the way he approached the original Jesus movement? First, he shows no fear, no hesitation. That's not normal. Second, he presents as blind, disoriented, vulnerable. But that just makes people lower their guard. This classic tradecraft, appear broken and in need of help to get inside. It's not listed as a specific red flag in Olson's terms, but it matches the type of story used when agents are dangled before the enemy in the hope that they'll be taken in by the other side so they can spy there. Olson describes several cases with similar scenarios. Third, Saul comes with a fully prepared cover story. It's neat, it's simple, and it cannot be verified. He heard the voice of Jesus. Fourth, he appears to have had an escape plan already in place. Why else would he trust the people who are helping him escape an assassination? He puts his life in their hands. He must have known them before. But who did he know in Damascus? If his persecutor colleagues were still around, there's your answer. They would also be capable of spotting assassins and foiling serious plans to kill Saul. We described this in Operation Messiah 2. Fifth, Saul pushes hard for access and leadership before anyone even knows if they can trust him. Meanwhile, back on the other side, his old colleagues show no alarm, no fear of exposure, no pursuit, no sign they felt betrayed. But they were not converted, so why go along with Saul's plans? They cannot have admired the belief in Jesus. They were there to persecute that movement. Also worth noting, there's no sign that Saul and his team ever prepared to transport prisoners from Damascus. We also talk about this in Operation Messiah. There were no logistics that would be needed. Taking people prisoner, certainly armed messianists in a foreign country, and then take them back to Jerusalem, that takes skill, that takes practice, and that takes a good team. If these were volunteers who offered their service to Saul, which is almost how Acts makes it out to be, where did they train for this? In the story, nobody even tried to take prisoners. It seems that part of the story was just a cover for a different kind of mission. And finally, one thing worth noticing, every one of the persecutors involved reacts the same way. They say and do nothing. No one protests. No one contradicts the story. No one grabs him by the arm and says, stop, we'll be accused of helping you defect, so we're not going to let you, even if we wanted to. But we don't want you to, because you'd be a traitor and you'd give us away. Nothing like that. No one says, wait a minute, we're not letting you go over to the enemy. You come back with us to Jerusalem, we'll take you to a doctor. It's as if they'd all been told what to do and what not to say. This is the first very strange pattern in the story of Saul, a pattern that strongly points to a cover story, or the story of a false defection. So what we talked about all came from the book of Acts. Saul's own letters are the other main source we have, 7 in total, written over the next 20 years under the name Paul. That's his heritage, and that's what Christianity hinges upon in lots of ways. 7 letters by this guy who says he heard the voice of Jesus. Once, I believe, because the voice is never quoted again in his letters. Something else that's remarkable, if Jesus was speaking to him, why not quote Jesus directly more often? We don't see Saul asking Jesus to speak to him again, even though the first time made such an impression that he supposedly risked his life and became a defector for Jesus. Anyway, let's look at what he actually wrote during the next 20 years, especially in Romans, often considered his most systematic work. We isolate 5 basic points. First, he redefines what Messiah means, not a liberator of the people, but someone who suffers and dies. That's not the kind of king the Jewish people had hoped for. He dismisses the Torah, the Jewish Bible. Obedience to God's law is no longer necessary. He turns being a Jew into a spiritual concept, not a nationalist concept. He urges submission to Roman authority. Everybody should pay their taxes to Rome. That's pacification. That's certainly nothing dangerous to the Roman government. Everybody's always talking about his collections for Jerusalem, but here he is collecting for Rome. And last, he turns the movement from a close-knit Jewish group into something that should be accessible to anyone. So he weakens the cohesion, and he provokes people who think differently. That's what we said in Operation Messiah. With all this, he was probably provoking people who disagreed with this. It's good to know their identities if you're working for the government. So he went from being a persecutor to someone who could identify those who could be persecuted, and perhaps he did the mopping up himself too. Maybe this writing was just an addition to his persecutor toolkit. Now, I don't want to sound dramatic, but this hit me like a lightning bolt too. I'd never looked at it quite this way before. We all know Paul's letters, Romans, Galatians, Corinthians, Ephesians. They sound holy, theological, distant. But here's the thing, they're all written to faraway places, not to Jerusalem, not to Damascus. Why is that? Damascus is where his conversion happened. That's where it all began. And yet no letter to Damascus, no thanks, no follow-up, no support. Nothing like you tried to kill me back then, but I forgive you. I'm for real now. I'd like to come back and prove it and talk faith because you're still my brothers. Nope. It's like he never looked back. So here's the thought experiment, something real analysts do all the time. Take what someone said later and apply it back to the beginning. Imagine Paul saying this on day one to the very people he just persecuted. Obey the authorities, be thankful the Messiah was killed, stop acting Jewish, and if you're persecuted again, bless your persecutors. Greetings, your persecutor. That would not be theology. It would be a slap in the face, a provocation, a psychological operation. And yet, those are the ideas he went on to preach for the next 20 years. And we call it the work of an apostle. So now we come to the reinvestigation, the second screening. We're not asking if Saul started out sincere. We're asking if he stayed on a straight line, or at least started walking a somewhat straighter one. Because in a world of intelligence and security, this kind of scrutiny is normal. It's not paranoia, it's procedure. You don't just get vetted once, you get reinvestigated, especially in sensitive roles. So let's run the check on Saul. Plenty of time has passed, plenty of evidence to go on. And what do we see? First of all, he's never indicted, never prosecuted, despite being loud, visible, and divisive, a deserter at that, despite causing havoc in multiple communities. And yet, he continues receiving VIP treatment from Roman officials again and again. And then there's Romans 13, obey the authorities, for they are God's servants. That's not theology, that's a government agent speaking. The authorities he was talking about do not even believe in that God. He also undermines rival leaders in the movement, the ones connected to the original Jesus. He questions their authority, sometimes openly. And the effect, division and confusion. He fractures the movement and it breaks from the inside. He reshapes the message too. He expands it beyond Jewish identity and makes it less revolutionary in political terms. Then there's the money. He says he's collecting funds for Jerusalem. He talks about it at length. God loves a cheerful giver, he says. But after all that, he never delivers the money. He's not a very cheerful giver himself. So you look at the full arc of his career, and you don't see a reformed man. You see patterns, pro-Roman patterns, or at the very least, anti-Messianist patterns. And nothing, not a single line, puts him at risk of the same fate as the man he claims to serve, not even close. So how does Saul of Tarsus look when we apply the red flags that James Olson provides in his book on catching spies? He calls them the telltale signs that an operation is controlled, meaning that the supposed defector may still be working for the other side. These are all the ones he lists in his book. They're not selected for this case in particular. And Saul, as Paul, raises red flags on nearly every one. First, low production. He offers no actionable intelligence, no persecutor tactics, no informers, no strategy. He delivers theology, not secrets. Frequent promises. He promises salvation, unity, and peace, but they are divine promises, not verifiable ones. The result, division, confusion, contradictory doctrine. Recurring excuses. When he vanishes or doesn't see the movement in Jerusalem, he has an excuse. He doesn't need to, he says. He has divine endorsement. He doesn't need their approval. He avoids testing. We have no evidence he was ever vetted. He visited Jerusalem only twice in 20 years and avoided those who distrusted him. No traps, no sting operations, no loyalty tests. If there were any, we don't know. But from what we can tell, he was never subjected to a real vetting process. Yeah, he did face some discussions in Jerusalem, but these were about theology, not loyalty, if they ever happened. No one asked him to expose Roman tactics or name names. He was never invited to work alongside the leadership, never tasked with dismantling the network he once served. And that's strange. Why not showcase this new brother in Jerusalem? Why not put him to use helping the cause? Why not test his loyalty with high-stakes assignments? But instead, nothing happens. No welcome, no debrief, no accountability. And in counterintelligence terms, that's a red flag in itself. Fearlessness. Despite his background, he moves freely. No arrest, no Roman pursuit. Even his first approach seems risk-free. He wasn't afraid of Rome, only of Jewish retaliation. And when that came, he ran, or appealed to Roman protection. He pushes for leadership right from the start, especially over money and messaging. He doesn't join, he takes over. He resists scrutiny. When challenged, he claims divine authority. Critics are sidelined or mocked. Suspicious origin. We've already covered the sudden dramatic conversion, but Saul himself never describes it, not once. If it really happened, as Acts claims, you'd expect him to mention it often, but he never does. And Luke's story in Acts, it only works if the entire government apparatus was asleep at the wheel, unless, of course, he remained on their side. Erratic demeanor. His letters swing between tenderness and rage, sometimes in the same passage. And Damascus, even there, the insiders don't trust him. From the very beginning, his arrival set off alarms. So what's the score? 10 possible red flags, 8 are clearly triggered. 2 we cannot answer for sure, because no real investigation ever took place. And that silence speaks volumes, because the people on the ground, he didn't act like a defector. He never gave up any secrets. No one needed a trap. They simply didn't trust him, and they were right. If this were a modern counterintelligence review, the alarm bells would be deafening. Now, according to Olson, a true double agent doesn't just show up with a dramatic backstory. They have a mission, and that mission comes with clear objectives. Here's Olson's list of 10 typical goals pursued by controlled double agents. Again, these are all the typical objectives that he mentions. They are not my observations. These are not fictional or selected to be applied to Saul. This is the complete list, and it comes straight from his book, To Catch a Spy. I've studied each one to see whether they apply to Saul of Tarsus, and the match is almost eerie. Saul ticks all the boxes. First, disinformation. That's how a double agent tries to disrupt the enemy. Saul defined or redefined what Messiah meant, transforming a revolutionary liberator into a submissive, suffering figure. In the eyes of the original movement, and many Jews ever since, this was disinformation. Even Jesus' own brother didn't recognize the man Saul described. Learning the opposition's methods, he was communicating with the movement. He understood how the communities functioned, what they believed, where they met, how they traveled. Identifying hostile figures, he sidelined leaders like James and Peter, reshaping their influence within the movement. And of course, he could identify anyone who was not happy with Roman rule. Understanding intelligence needs, he kept up to date on the needs of both sides. Acquiring intelligence, he mapped everything, leadership structures, locations, loyalties, and networks. Disrupting operations, think of the circumcision controversy or the constant infighting over law, conflicts that fractured and stalled the movement, not to mention his call to obey the authorities. Handling finances, he managed large transfers of money, often with unclear outcome and no independent verification. Discrediting leadership, he undermined earlier apostles and positioned himself as the sole legitimate voice of Jesus. Probing new regions, he traveled widely, almost like he was feeling out where the message resonated and where opposition surfaced. His teachings often flushed out local resistance, particularly through messages of submission and obedience. Pitching leaders, he delivered Rome's ideal message: obey the authorities, pay your taxes, submit, while cloaking it in divine revelation. He attracted enemies and either made them doubt themselves or identified them if they protested. This is textbook behavior, and it matches Olson's checklist almost perfectly. As an illustration, let's take a closer look at Paul's so-called collections for Jerusalem, the campaign he claims was meant to support the poor. One name keeps surfacing, Titus. It's a very Roman name. But Titus isn't just a courier. He operates more like a fixer or even a scout or enforcer. 2 Corinthians 8, Paul says Titus was sent ahead to complete the act of grace. He travels before Paul, prepares the ground, delivers instructions. That's not just ministry, that could be called field work. Paul calls the communities ecclesia, which we usually translate as church, but it can also mean cell or small group, an assembly. In counterinsurgency terms, that's another kind of group. Titus's job: ensure cooperation, secure contributions, and push the message. Submit, pay up, and wait for the Lord. It's not exactly a call to revolution. And once they're visiting, Titus can observe, gather intel. And while this unfolds, Paul is dictating his letter to Tertius, who's writing it all down. They're staying at the home of Erastus. It's a Roman city official. So you have Titus, Tertius, and Erastus. So what are we really looking at? It could very well be a covert Roman operation, still using its former persecutor to monitor, manage, and control the movement. And one final hint: the money collected by Titus never reached Jerusalem. Where it went, we can pretty much guess. Maybe this trio was helping Saul achieve the typical double agent objective: take away the enemy's money. Now you might be thinking, come on, this is way too much. But here's the thing: this is exactly what Jesus' original followers suspected. We just don't have anything they wrote. We have to deduce their standpoint from Acts and Sauls Letters. According to Acts and early tradition, they tried to get rid of him. They didn't trust him for a second. He didn't pass the smell test. He didn't feel right. And according to James Olson, that matters. Most experienced case officers will tell you, Olson writes, that although they cannot explain why some agents don't look, sound, or smell right, U.S. counterintelligence should trust those instincts and dig more deeply whenever a case officer reports that something about an operation feels funny. Well, this operation feels funny from start to finish. It's hard to make the possibility more obvious, short of Saul shouting, "Hail to the Caesar and death to the enemies of Rome," on his way to Rome. So why haven't we taken the judgment of the original Jesus movement, including Jesus' own brother, more seriously? Excuse me. If they thought he was dangerous, shouldn't we at least consider the possibility that they were right? Now we come to the final 2 sections of this presentation. It's called Patterns and ACH. Every counterintelligence expert says the same thing. You can read the books I showed you or find other sources. They all say the same thing. Pattern is everything. You don't chase hard proof of a single incident, not unless you catch the suspect in the act or he confesses outright. Instead, you look for patterns. That's how deception reveals itself. That's what sets you on the trail. Counterintelligence work is about stripping away the surface, like layers of paint, as William R. Johnson puts it in his book on counterintelligence, until the original canvas shows through, and maybe even the hand that painted over it. And Saul's story, it's all layered paint. And once you start peeling it back, the same patterns appear over and over again. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. To understand Saul's possible role, we need to ask a basic counterintelligence question. What did Rome want? What were their strategic goals in Judea? Next, we will talk about policy and then what actions and agents would take to achieve the goals of the government. I'll combine them all in one slide in a little bit. But we start with strategy. This is based on my personal knowledge as a historian about what any occupation force would want to achieve and occupy territory, applied to the Roman occupation of Judea. It's not hard to make a list. I will mention 4 things. First, neutralize radical messianism, not religion in general, but anything that looked like a revolution, a rival king, a messiah. Second, divide and conquer, break Jewish unity and prevent serious resistance from forming. Third, promote obedience, get people to comply, ideally with words, not with force, because force leads to backlash. And fourth, shift loyalty, not just to Rome, but to a tamer, safer version of the faith. Now, if someone's message ends up achieving these exact goals, shouldn't we ask why, especially if that person is a trained agent? What would the goals be for an agent set into a movement like this? So we go from strategy to policy. First, encourage submission to the authorities. Make obedience feel righteous. Make it sound like God's will. Second, break up the target group. Create rivalries, sow doubt. The fragmented movement is a harmless one. Divide and conquer, the oldest trick in the book. Third, neutralize the radicals. Push the sharpest voices to the margins. Soften their message. Get them to wait or give up. Fourth, redirect the money. Extract it. Make sure it never funds real resistance. And fifth, gather intelligence. Who's leading? Who's loyal? What's coming next? The kind of information that stops revolts before they start. These are not just vague ideas, they're tactical goals. And if you see them happening, you have to ask, who benefited? And was it just coincidence, or was it the work of a law enforcement officer doing his job? Now let's zoom in on a tactical level. What do we actually see Saul doing on the ground? First, he travels along Roman administrative roads, not through the hills or countryside like Jesus, but on roads used by officials and the military. Second, he builds tight-knit communities, later called churches, but seen through this lens, they look like something else entirely. He never built one, never led a service as far as we know. They look less like houses of worship and more like cells. And he's not alone. He has helpers like Titus, Gaius, members of Caesar's household. They go ahead of him. They gather intel, prep the ground, and shape the message. At one point, someone named Tertius, as we talked about, writes down his words, a letter urging obedience to Roman authorities and the payment of taxes, while they're staying with Erastus, a Roman city treasurer. So a Roman official is literally hosting this message that people must pay taxes to Rome. Once again, he's collecting for Rome, not for Jerusalem. At some point, you have to ask, what more do you need? Do you need a picture of him in an I Love Rome t-shirt? He stirs unrest and then evades punishment by saying, I'm a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar. And off he goes, straight to safety. He pulls authority away from the original messianic leadership. He mocks their standing. He opens the movement to outsiders and calls for obedience, not to the God of Israel, but to Rome. These are not accidents, they're tactical choices, and they align perfectly with the behavior of someone running a long-term operation. So here we pull it all together into one layered structure. This strategic, policy, and tactical. At the top, you have strategy, the what. You can see it on your screen. We've already covered it. In the middle, you have policy, the how the goals are pursued step by step. And at the base, tactical, the what he actually does, where Saul's real-world behavior comes in. Put it all together, and this is not random. It's a playbook. And it aligns uncannily well with the known goals of Roman counterinsurgency. I don't think we can make this diagram for James or Peter. And we see that even in the humor that he uses in his letters, the pattern holds. On this sheet, I collected some examples of where I see the humor. These are all quotes from Saul himself, from the accounts that frame him. Here he is, swearing he's not lying, not once but twice. My conscience confirms it by the Holy Spirit. I assure you before God, this is no lie. That's not normal language for someone who's trusted. Next to humor, we also see theatrics, blinding lights, heavenly voices, earthquakes that conveniently open prison doors. It's a script of someone trying very hard to sound chosen, or to control the narrative with a touch of mockery. And just when you think it's all holy fire and visions, the tone shifts. Now it's about tax compliance, obedience to Rome, and the idea that authority is divine. Even when that authority does not believe in the God of Israel, he doesn't just submit, he teaches others to. Pay your taxes, obey the government, it's God's will. Then there's the cast of characters, readings from Roman officials, hosted by a Roman city treasurer, claim ties to Caesar's own household. So you ask yourself, what movement hostile to Rome is built like this? And right in the middle of it all, bless those who persecute you. I mean, if you were writing a parody of a double agent laundering trust into a resistance movement, it would be difficult to top this. Now let's take a step back. If we want to see whether Saul truly changed sides or only pretended to, we need a method that strips away bias and emotion. The CIA developed exactly that. It's called the Analysis of Competing Hypotheses, or ACH. And this is designed for cases with ambiguous, politicized, or incomplete information. I think you would agree that this is one of those cases. This method answers the question, or helps you answer the question, Which theory is least contradicted by the evidence? So that's what I used, following the advice of a university teacher and one of my mentors who teaches this type of analysis. We begin with stating the possible hypotheses for this case, which at this moment are H1, so hypothesis 1, sincere conversion. H2, Roman agent, and that means false defection, the working theory. H3, continued loyalty to the high priest, and H4, possible psychological instability. In this table, we combine the four hypotheses with the evidence. Each row lists a single piece of evidence with its source clearly named. This evidence can also include the absence of something you would normally expect to see in the sources, for example, an accusation of desertion if an agent did what Saul did. Each piece of evidence is evaluated under each hypothesis with a simple label: C for consistent with the hypothesis, I for inconsistent, and N for neutral. In addition to that, there are two ratings. R stands for reliability, which A is the highest, meaning the source is strong. And weight is based on the evidence's relevance to the conclusion, so how much it should matter. So what does the pattern show? We have the evidence. A couple items now. No panic among his old colleagues, no treason charge, no use of Saul to expose others. The Damascus story, multiple versions, no witnesses. His escape, implausible, and then 3 years of silence, followed by 14 more. All of this is hard to reconcile with a sincere conversion, because a real defection would have had an impact and consequences. But all this government passivity fits the false defector scenario quite well. That's what ACH does. It reveals when an explanation quietly fails, quietly holds. You just don't count what's there, you notice what's missing, and you're forced to confront what each piece of evidence means for every hypothesis. I verified this matrix both with an AI assistant and with Dr. Guillaume de Valk, who teaches this professionally. Both confirmed the method was applied correctly. Of course, you could always add hypotheses or bring in more elements if you want to, but the situation is not that complicated. Like I said, one story, 7 letters, and a bunch of guys on horses. There's a real danger of over-analysis or of making it look more complicated than it is. And this is only the beginning. I want to emphasize that this kind of analysis works best as a team effort. And in my experience, that's exactly what's been missing from this debate. Most discussions about Paul's sincerity are one-on-one, at a distance, scholar against scholar, theory against theory. And in my view, that's not the way forward. There's been no joint investigation, no structured team effort like any serious agency or organization would conduct if they truly wanted the best result. I think that's what we need here. And that's why I'm very grateful to be speaking with you, Jacob, on this podcast. Because it would be great if we could gather a few people with different backgrounds and perspectives, and run this process properly, starting from different viewpoints. We could do that under the guidance of an independent facilitator, someone trained in managing analytical discussions. And I've already found someone with a lot of experience who's willing to do that. Ideally, we'd also include a designated devil's advocate like the method recommends. And then we can work forward, toward a shared verdict, one that could stand up to scrutiny from all sides. Dissenting views would not be a problem, they'd be part of the strength of the outcome. The full matrix, based on Operation Messiah alone, is going to be available at my website, operationmessiah.com, for anyone who wants to explore it right now. I'll continue adding on to it, for example, with observations drawn from James Olson work and the input others will give, hopefully. But the ACH, as published on the site, already includes the most important evidence from the book that Colonel Sheldon and I wrote, Operation Messiah. So what does the method actually tell us right now? Based on the available evidence, just the material already presented in the book, here's how the hypotheses ranked. First place, Saul was a Roman agent. This hypothesis came out on top. It has the most explanatory power. The access, the protection, the behavioral patterns, the message. It all aligns. The pattern fits. For what it's worth, AI agrees, and the AI is quite good at detecting patterns. I think it can help with this kind of analysis as an assistant. It has no emotional investment in the outcome. Second hypothesis, psychological issues, mania, delusion, trauma, or bipolar disorder. These things have all been said about Paul. That could explain some odd behavior, but it doesn't account for the consistent pro-Roman alignment or the long-term strategic effect of his actions. A Roman psychologist who contacted me a few years ago agreed with the Roman agent theory. He thought Paul might be a narcissist, but not mentally ill in a way that explains his entire career arc. Third, continued work for the high priest. That fits the paperwork from Damascus, but it falls apart when you look at the reach, the scale, and the Roman protection Saul received. The high priest did not have that kind of international influence or even that kind of agenda. And frankly, I doubt the high priest would support an operation where the agent ends up mocking Jewish law the way Saul did. And last, we have the traditional view, Saul as a sincere convert transformed by divine vision. This was the least consistent with the evidence. That might be surprising, but this is not a theological conclusion. It's a pattern matching exercise. And in a way, it simply confirms what the original followers of Jesus already sensed. They didn't trust him either. So when you apply counterintelligence logic, when you look for patterns, the conversion story just doesn't hold. Maybe the outcome is uncomfortable given the mainstream narrative, but counterintelligence is not about comfort. It's about facing reality, so to speak. Again, this is not about theology. It's a counterintelligence perspective. And if that's not your lens, it's okay to stop here. I was still a Christian when I first stumbled upon this possibility. So it doesn't come from anger or mockery or rejection at all. It started as a question, a strange moment when I realized I could not look at the image the same way anymore. I realized I've probably been fooled for a while, and I probably still don't see everything. There's more going on here than I can grasp, I'm sure of it. But beneath this image, with Jesus on a cross and Saul at his writing table, I now hear something I never heard before, which is not spiritual revelation, but Roman laughter. The kind of mockery you hear in a military culture, the cruel kind, the dark kind. Rome was a culture that crucified for sport. They crowned a condemned man with thorns and called it a coronation. The gospel described that mockery, but here's the part we may have missed. What if Saul of Tarsus took to the same Roman humor and turned it into some kind of quasi-theology? What if his letters didn't begin in reverence but in irony? Someone with his background, educated, brilliant, ruthless, connected, he could have written text that mimicked belief and passed as authentic. Modern intelligence services do that. They infiltrate movements by copying the language and ideology. We call it influencing or foreign entity influencing. You hear a lot about it today. Online manipulation, disinformation. Maybe Saul did the same thing, not with a phone or a platform, but with letters. Messianism with a twist. Your Messiah is dead, be thankful for it, and obey Rome. And somehow it caught on. That would explain the contradictions, the odd tone, and the mockery beneath the surface. James Olson says we humans tend to believe what we want to believe. We see what we want to see, and deception thrives on that. So ask yourself, what if Saul never changed? What if he stayed the same man, only now with a pen instead of a warrant or a sword? The crucified Messiah as a psychological weapon against Jewish resistance, and his letters a parody. I raised these concerns years ago, first in my thesis, The Perfect Spy, and then in Operation Messiah, in Small Wars and Insurgencies, and we repeated them in the book. In the beginning, I reached out to a Jewish organization. I remember that very clearly. I asked if they'd ever seen the crucified Messiah as Roman mockery of their faith, and they told me, we don't read the New Testament, that's not our story. And I understood. For many Jews, the crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms. They never accepted it, and most were not even curious about how Paul tried to justify it. Some did believe it, and more maybe than Saul ever expected. And once it spread, once the story took hold, maybe even he was surprised by its power. So here's the final question. Did I just show you a baseless pattern, or did Saul know exactly what he was doing? Are we trying to see hard an agent in all of this? Or if you disagree, are you trying too hard to see an apostle? Because from my perspective, to dismiss this theory, you'd have to ignore some common sense. When patterns line up this consistently, it usually signals intent. Because all these elements, these alignments, cross strategy, behavior, policy, writing, even language, that cannot just be a coincidence. The way he checks every box on James Olson's list in To Catch a Spy. By any normal logic, this should not be possible. Not this many patterns, not this much structure, not across this many levels. And yet it all fits. Saul of Tarsus had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. I remember my professor Frank Ankersmit saying that at the beginning, because he was convinced too. Even Paul scholars call him a trickster. They ask, if you were the original Jesus movement, would you have trusted him? I read that in a book. They call him a genius, a chameleon, slippery, brilliant, creative. Well, he didn't suddenly become all those things after his conversion. He must have already been like that as a persecutor. And that's the part I think many people missed. He never changed. He was a skilled, driven operative who also happened to enjoy writing and experimenting with religious ideas. A well-educated law enforcement officer. That may not seem unusual today, but based on Acts, I think we put too simple a frame around Saul's early role. It's not hard to imagine him devising a clever long-term strategy. Or maybe someone else did. Maybe they tried it and it worked. It happens all the time. Not everything works, but sometimes it does. Either he thought of it or I did. But what's remarkable is this. Everything that everything that followed unfolded as if he did think of it. Either way, when you apply modern counterintelligence standards, like Olson's red flag checklist, this is classic double agent behavior. It fits almost perfectly. So how do you explain that? That's evidence in itself, the pattern. In the end, maybe this brilliant trickster never changed. Maybe the conversion never happened. Maybe he just stayed who he always was. Once an agent, always an agent as it goes. The question I've been asked is, how can this be? Some might ask, if this is really true, if it fits all these CI red flag patterns, why hasn't anyone said this before? Well, some have. In fact, it's exactly what the original followers of Jesus believed. They didn't trust him. They even tried to stop him, and they never bought his story. And maybe that's why the Vatican is in Rome and not Jerusalem. Aside from his followers, it also resembles closely what Professor Robert Ehrman has said since the 1980s. According to him, Paul was far too aligned with Roman interests. You asked me by email, what direction did Ehrman give? Truth is, I hadn't even heard of his work when I wrote my thesis. I only learned about him later, not from a scholar, but from a Dutch TV host. I would have loved to know sooner that a respected academic had already raised this red flag. Later, I was in contact with him, and he kindly endorsed the second edition of my book, The Perfect Spy, or alias Paulus. He said his work, if taken seriously, could shake Western religious thought to its foundations. And in Operation Messiah, we cited his work, along with earlier suspicions. But we went further. We argued Saul wasn't just an apostle who happened to use Roman roads and contacts, but that he was part of a Roman operation from the start. His defection was never sincere. We considered the alternative, that he was working for the Jewish high priest. But that explanation, I think, no longer fits. His mission reached too far. Too many Roman names surfaced: Titus, Gaius, Erastus, members of Caesar's household. And Rome controlled regional security. Even if he started as a collaborator, the fingerprints are Roman from start to finish. He also asked, couldn't Paul genuinely have believed in Jesus as Messiah while also working for Rome? That's a fair question. It's a valid hypothesis, and you can plot it between H1 and H2 on the matrix. But in practice, I don't think it holds up. First, because the simpler explanation works better. The hybrid theory would still have to assume a dramatic personality shift from enforcer to self-sacrificing visionary. But continuity is a safer bet if it fits. Once an agent, always an agent. Second, the Messiah that Paul is promoting was not Jewish. No national deliverance, no kingship, no Torah. So you could say this was not reinterpretation, it bordered on parody. And again, it fit Roman goals too well. De-radicalize, spiritualize, diffuse. If you look at it through this lens, there's even cruelty to it, almost like a Roman joke, a persecutor's joke. Third, his behavior doesn't match a serious convert or a sincere convert. He vanishes for 17 years. He avoids the apostles. And when he writes about his own people, he sounds angry, even cruel. If that's love, it came with a fist. When FBI agent Robert Hansen was finally caught, after decades of spying for the Soviets, he asked a single question: what took you so long? And maybe that's a better question here. Not is this really possible, but why did it take us so long to see it? Because it is possible. It's simple and it's grounded. And it just assumes one thing: the man never changed. And now it's been vetted by scholars, by intelligence professionals, and by method. So this is the last sheet of my presentation, and I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to join that ACH project, the website. I want to underline again that this is not about proving a point, but about testing all the evidence. And if it's not complete or wrong even, we need to know. I want to know. But until that happens, we have to assume what the evidence suggests, and that is that what we may be looking at the most successful intelligence operation in history. The first question is simple. Why was there no production? Why didn't the so-called defector ever share insider information, strategic insights, or even basic help with his new allies? Not once in 20 years, not in acts, not in his letters. And if he wasn't a real insider, then why was he treated as one? That's what the ACH method is for. Which hypothesis fits the entire pattern best? You're invited to test it with us. Thank you for your patience. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
All right, so let's get our faces back up on the screen. If you could see. There we go. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Do you think that Paul was related to the Herodian family by any chance?
I have no clear thoughts on that, really. I didn't really study that possibility that much. I know
Hmm.
some people say that he may have been related, but it doesn't really matter to the thesis that I'm exploring, because if he was or he wasn't, I think we already also talked about this in Operation Messiah. It's possible, and it would be an interesting addition to the possibility, but it's not really vital. So I'm not sure either way.
What do you think of Professor Eisenman's argument about linking Saulus, the kinsman of King Agrippa II, mentioned by Josephus, to the biblical Paul?
It's again really I don't really know. I don't think we know anything for sure about Saul of Tarsus. Where he came from, who his parents were, and his ancestors, his relatives. Based on Acts and the letters, we cannot really say anything about it. And that the name also pops up in another source. Of course, then it's possible that's true, but I don't think we have a way of checking whether it's true or not. So again, I think it's an interesting possibility, but it cannot become much more than that.
My last question is, what do you make of scholars like disagreeing with each other about how many of these letters are authentic? And lately, more attention has been given once again to the idea that possibly none of them are authentic. Would this impact the theory or not necessarily because whoever wrote these letters had to get that information about Paul from somewhere?
Yes, I agree with the last thing you're saying. I think it is. I've thought about this. I've also seen, I think, the episode in your podcast where you discussed this possibility. I cannot really think of anyone who had a motive to come up with a guy like this completely out of thin air. He's a very unlikely candidate for that kind of role. If you want to invent somebody, this is a very complex personality to invent with a lot of contradictions. I think I cannot think of anybody who'd have a motive to do that really. So of course it may be possible that someone invents an entire person on paper, but then this is quite a strange guy to invent, so to speak.
Before we close, I want to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase Operation Messiah will be in the description below and in the pinned comment, and the link to the website will also be provided in the description and the pinned comment. That being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Thijs Voskuilen.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.